How are you? Nice to see you. I'm going to just make a few opening remarks. My colleagues have circulated a longer statement, but I'll be happy to take your questions. First, my compliments to our Korean and Canadian finance ministers who hosted this meeting today. They did a nice job demonstrating, I think, that the promise that this forum, the G20, holds for cooperation on the global stage. Our meetings today were largely about growth, about Greece, and about financial reform. As you've heard, I know the world economy is coming back stronger more quickly than many people expected. And we heard today, and I heard last night, from really countries around the world, encouraging signs of building momentum, broader recovery, and I think that's very encouraging. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do still. We want to work to reinforce that recovery, and as I'm sure we'll discuss, we want to make sure that as we are working to reinforce a recovery led by the private sector, we want to make sure we lay conditions for a more balanced global pattern of global growth, and that's going to require a very substantial set of reforms across the major economies over the next several years. On Greece, I had a number of conversations, very useful conversations with my colleagues from Europe, from the IMF, and I spoke to the Greek finance minister this morning. And I want to just say that I very much welcome the greater sense of urgency we're seeing, and I want to encourage the Greek authorities, the Europeans, and the IMF to move quickly to put in place a package of strong economic reforms and substantial and concrete financial support. On financial reforms, we're getting to the decisive moment, both in the United States, where, as you know, the Senate will consider next week what are the most sweeping set of financial reforms the U.S. has contemplated since the Great Depression. And I'm very confident we're going to have broad support for a very strong package of reforms, and I think the world will welcome the U.S. moving to address the key vulnerabilities in our system that help contribute to this crisis. And very important, the rest of the world sees the United States acting forcefully to make sure that we're not going to be a source of instability in the future, that the U.S. can be a source of strength, a source of growth, a source of stability to the global financial system in the future. Now, of course, it's very important to us that as we move in the United States to raise standards, impose stronger constraints on risk-taking, improve transparency in the financial sector, that we're doing so across the major financial centers, across the major economies. And I believe we have a very broad consensus on the core elements of reforms. But of course, as you know, the key test is going to be when we translate that into, for example, a new global agreement on capital requirements, capital standards, liquidity requirements, leverage ratios. That is the most important task ahead of us. And we're now getting to the point where we're going to have to get down to the tougher judgments. And I want to just make it clear that we will insist on, let me say differently, we will fight very hard to try to make sure that we were put in place, again, across the major financial centers, a very strong set of more conservative constraints on leverage and risk-taking, because that is the most important thing we can do to help reduce the risk of future crises like this. Again, I think we've got very broad support on the basic elements of reform. You can see it on the emphasis everybody attaches to transparency and disclosure across markets, bringing derivative markets out of the dark into a broad, comprehensive framework of oversight, and trying to develop better mechanisms for putting failing financial institutions out of their misery safely without posing greater risks to the economy, to the taxpayer. So with that, with those remarks and with statements I made in my written statement, I'd be happy to answer your questions. Yes.
Your Korean counterpart said there wasn't a single discussion on currency. Was that true, and was that disappointing for you if it was true?
No, we discussed, as we always do, the broad constellation of policies that we think it's important to try to make sure that, as you've heard us say before, that we have a more balanced pattern of growth globally. And what that means to us is, and there's really three things that requires. In the United States, it's very important that we're taking steps to make sure that we're strengthening private investment, that we are as you know, putting in place a more stable financial system. We're encouraging a shift to greater savings. And in fact, you've seen a very substantial change in savings behavior in the United States very recently. We're borrowing much less as a share of our economy from the rest of the world now. You've seen our current account imbalance, external imbalance come down very sharply over this period of time. And of course, as the recovery strengthens, we're going to move quickly and forcibly to bring down our fiscal deficits to a more sustainable position. That's the U.S. Now, if you look beyond the U.S., I think you see countries around the world recognizing that they do not want to rely as heavily as they had in the past on the U.S. consumer to provide a source of growth and strength. And so in the major surplus countries, developed countries that are lagging the global recovery, where growth is still very slow, we'd like to see more policy reforms that strengthen consumption, strengthen domestic demand. That's going to be very important to us. Now, in the emerging markets, you're already seeing a very substantial shift, not just stronger growth, but growth led by stronger domestic demand, stronger consumption growth. You see that in China, in Brazil, many in India, many of the other major economies. That's very encouraging. And of course, we want to see that accompanied by a shift where it's obviously important to exchange rate reforms that move to more market-oriented exchange rates. That basic framework of policies, again, I believe, has broad consensus. And at this meeting, like in all our meetings, we talked about progress on those dimensions. And you can see, again, some encouraging signs of shift, but we got a lot more to do. Yes.
Alan Beattie from the Financial Times. Mr. Secretary, Minister Flaherty from Canada seems to think that opinion is swinging Canada's way on the question of bank taxes versus
all things capital. Are swinging Canada's way. As the minister said, they won the medal in the Olympics, a hockey medal, and that's a good sign for Canada as well. But you should finish your sentence. I apologize, Daniel.
So, as in the hockey, are you going to accept defeat on bank tax as well?
Well, let me tell you what we're trying to do, what we think is important. We're trying to establish the basic principle that where governments are exposed to risk and putting out financial fires like this, that taxpayers don't bear the burden of paying for the costs of those actions. So we propose in the United States a fee on risk that would be paid by the largest banks over time to cover the costs of our emergency financial rescue. That is a simple, fair, basic imperative. And as you've seen, there is significant support among the other major economies, not all, of course, for taking similar actions. And the IMF gave us today, or last week, a very thoughtful paper that examines alternative ways of achieving that objective. And that was helpful. We're going to move in the United States because we think this is the necessary thing to do. And I suspect you're going to find when countries see what we do, and they're going to wait to see exactly how we do it in the United States, I suspect you'll find other countries moving to adopt similar measures. And I can't tell at this stage how far it's going to go. Obviously, you've seen from Canada and other countries a certain lack of enthusiasm for that idea. And it's understandable. If you look at how Canada fared in this financial crisis, they came out of this relatively well. They'd run a much more stable, well-managed financial system. So there's no surprise, and no surprise to me at this meeting that you saw a diversity of views on this. But again, we're going to do what's necessary for the United States, what's in our interest, and I think the world's going to want to watch what we do. And I suspect that'll provide a basis for other actions across some of the other major economies. And I think that would be good, a sensible thing. Again, the basic imperative should be that we're designing not just capital requirements and leverage ratios that limit incentives for future risk-taking, but we establish a basic proposition by our actions that we shouldn't have the taxpayers bear the burden of having to solve these financial crises. Yes.
Thank you, Secretary. I just wonder what common sense did you get with Vice Premier Wang Qishan a couple of weeks ago when you visited Beijing?
What was the
common sense? What
common sense?
Yeah. What mutual understanding with the Chinese side when you visited Beijing?
Common sense in terms of agreement, not common sense. There's a lot of common sense from Wang Qishan always.
Okay. But what's the mutual understanding with the Chinese side when you visited Beijing? And when did you expect that China will move in the near future?
Well, I want to be careful how I say this, okay? So in answering this question, I'm going to repeat what I've said before. Nothing new or different in how I respond to that basic question. This is China's choice. And I believe that China will decide it's in their interest to renew the reform process, to resume the process of exchange rate reform that they had embarked on, very important shift several years ago, suspended during the crisis. And I think they'll do it because it's in their interest. It's obviously important to the world as a whole, and that remains my view.